The title, as you know, is Kant on the ontological status of time. This has got basically three parts. First part is basically introduction, where I will be introducing various terminologies to understand the metaphysical exposition of the concept of time. And in the second part, we will deal with the metaphysical exposition of the concept of time. And finally, the concluding part, I will say what I mean by ontology of time for Kant is subjective. Now, let us start with what is ontology. So, what this paper aims to provide is an exposition of Kant's view about the ontological status of time. So, therefore, we should know what is meant by ontology. And ontology is a study of the building blocks of the real. It also specifies what its general features are and the way these building blocks are related to one another. So in other words, as Quine has spoken about ontology, it is a question about what there is and what is the nature of that, the things that there are, and how they are related. Now, how to specify the ontological status of an entity or a thing? Now, we can identify basically two steps in order to specify the ontological status of an entity. First of all, we must determine whether it is something that is basic or fundamental. So, it is necessary whether it is something that is emergent or something that is already there, that is something most basic. And if it is not basic, how, or if it is an emergent thing, how it is related to the basic entity. So this is one thing which we determine when we speak about the ontological status of an entity. Similarly, in a different way, we can say, second step is to determine the locus of the thing. Locus of the thing means where it exists. That is, to do this, we need to answer the following questions. Now, the first question, is the entity in question in the world of universals? We know Plato's world of universals. And particularly this question arises when we are going to speak about the question of universals. What is their status? Whether they have got an existence of their own, they exist in a world of their own, or it is merely a name, or whether it has its existence in the mind, or whether it is in the world of particulars. So that is how we are going to specify the ontological status of an object. So therefore, these are the questions that we need to answer. Is the entity in question in the world of universals? Is it in the world of particulars? Or is it in the mental world? Or is it in the socio-linguistic world? Now, our question is about the fixation of the ontological status of time. So where does we can find out how does the question of time, or what is the ontological status of time? So therefore, to answer this question, what is the ontological status of time, he has to answer other two questions. Is time something basic? In the sense, is something irreducible? Emphasis is on the second question about the locus of time. So where is time located? And he has got a very clear-cut answer, and according to him, time is located in the mind. And time, for him, is a constituent element of the human sensibility. And more precisely, it is an a priori intuition. So we don't worry about these things. We'll be coming back to what is meant by an a priori intuition in Kant. Now, before coming to the other part of the exposition, let us look at what are the various philosophical positions on time till the two dominant philosophical positions of time that we have. One is the absolutist view of time. And what is absolutist view of time? it says that time has its being independent of the mind and is real. So time is real and independent of the mind, and this we can call the absolutist view of time, or this is how Kant characterizes the view about the reality of time. The next is the idealist view of time. As you know, idealism is speaking about the dependence of entities on the mind. So time is mind dependent or exists in the mind. This is the idealist view of time. Now, absolutist view, when you look at the absolutist view, it itself has got two versions. Both these versions actually, Kant is mentioning these versions, not exactly in the same place, but at different places. The first view is that time is something that subsists by itself and is the condition for the possibility of things. And we are familiar with this view of time. And particularly in the Newtonian physics takes up this view of time. Time is the condition for the existence of physical objects or material objects. So this is the absolutist one version of the absolutist view of time. So we can conceive time as a big receptacle in which physical objects are situated or physical object inhibits. So in that sense, this receptacle is the condition for the possibility of physical objects. This is one view. And second view is time is determination of things which are by themselves non-spatial and temporal. I'm sure you are also familiar with this view of time as well. Particularly, this view was championed by, or a view similar to this was championed by Leibniz. For him, we know that basic entities are monads. And what are space and time, or how does space and time emerge? Space and time emerge because of the way these monads are related among themselves. So in that sense, time is time is determined by the non-spatial and non-temporal entities, which are monads for Leibniz. So this is the second view of time. So here, time is construed as, in a certain sense, a certain kind of as a set of relations among monads. Now, Kant is rejecting both these versions of absolutism and wants to come to have or comes to establish his own view about the time. Now, what is Kant's argument against the first version? In sum and substance, his argument is that the absolutist version, the first version of the absolutist concept of time, reduces itself to mere absurdity. In other words, it is leading to some kind of a contradiction. It is leading us to absurdity. So therefore, we cannot accept it. Why? Because it advocates an eternal, infinite thing, which is neither a substance nor a property that inherent something. So look at the earlier view that we had spoken about it. The time is is like a receptacle in which temporal entities exist. Okay, so if it is like a receptacle in which temporal entities exist, then it has got a being of its own, but you cannot call time a substance, nor can you say time is a property of something. Okay, so therefore it is like an eternal, infinite thing which is neither substance nor can we say it is a property of something. But at the same time, it is a necessary condition of the existence of all things. Things can exist only if time is there. So therefore it is a necessary condition of things. And as such, it would remain all objects are removed from time. So we can remove things from time, yet time would remain. The idea would become clear if we are going to compare it to the space. From space, objects can be removed and that space remains. This is the belief. So this is how we have to construe time. Now, time is a self-subsisting non-entity. So what does it mean? These two, this way of understanding time would mean time subsists by itself but at the same time, it is not an entity. So it is here that Kant is raising the question: how can something be self-subsisting, but at the same time be a non-entity? So which is an absurdity. So self-subsisting non-entity is basically a contradiction for him. So it converts, this view of time converts everything, including our own existence, into mere illusion. So if this view of time is right, then everything that we perceive, everything that we have, is merely an illusion. That we can't say, because we know that nothing can exist in a contradictory object. Okay, of course, contradictory object itself is we cannot maintain. So this concept of time is absurd, or it is leading to absurdity. So we cannot grant anything that exists in space and time, or particularly space. Here we are concerned with time only. Is real. So it converts everything, including our own existence, into mere illusion. What happens? We ourselves exist in time. So if time is not real, our own existence is mere illusion. Now, Kant is also rejecting the second version of the absolutist view of time. And according to this view, we have seen time is a property or a determinations of things which are not themselves temporal. Now, if time is a property or a determination of things, determination of things, then is not really on the condition. That is very clear, because look at the Leibnizian view. In the Leibnizian view, monads are there, and it is because the monads determine what time is. So time cannot precede monads. Okay. Now, there is a problem with this view according to him. Our cognition regarding time can only be a posteriori. So whatever we know about time, if time is determined by object existing independent of us, okay, then whatever knowledge, whatever cognitions that we have about time is only a posteriori. But the issue here is that we know that there are synthetic a priori propositions of time. So there are propositions which are both analytic and there are propositions which are both synthetic and a priori at the same time. So you know that Kant has already advocated for such kind of a propositions. As an example of such a proposition, he is giving example of such propositions about time. He is speaking about time is one. As an example, he cites time is one dimensional. So look at this proposition. Why it is synthetic is very clear. The concept of being one dimensional is not contained in the concept of time. Therefore, time is one dimensional is a synthetic proposition and not an analytic proposition. And this proposition is not something which we have arrived through our experience. We have never seen, none of us have ever seen one-dimensional time. So therefore, this this statement or this proposition or a principle, time is one-dimensional, is both synthetic as well as a priori. Now, if our cognitions pertaining to time can only be a posteriori, okay, that is what, according to this version of the time, all our time is a determination of things existing independent of us. In that case, all our knowledge, all our cognition about time can only be a posteriori. And if that is the case, then this version of absolutism cannot explain the possibility of synthetic a priori propositions. So there are synthetic a priori propositions about time, and according to this version of absolutism of time, we cannot explain the possibility of synthetic a priori propositions of time. All synthetic a priori propositions, according to the present account, has to become a posteriori, not a priori. So that is, and according to Kant, if there are synthetic a priori propositions of time, we should be the concept of time that we hold, the account of time that we hold, should be able to explain how this is possible. So Kant is making an argument for an idealist view of time. Now, in a nutshell, his argument is like this: time is either absolute or ideal. Okay, and then he rules out the possibility that time is absolute, and then he is coming to the conclusion that time is therefore ideal. Now, let us try to see what time is for an idealist. For an idealist, time is part of the constitution of the mind. Or in other words, for an idealist, time has to be figured out in the mind. Time is mind dependent. Now, Kant uses the term representations to characterize or denote the class of elements that constitute the mind. So mind has got number of elements within it. And Kant has got a general term for all of them. He calls the term representations. Okay. And since time is one of the constituent elements of the mind, it is a representation of the mind. So that is one thing. It is one of the elements. Time is basically one of the elements within our mind, and he calls it a representation. One of the representations. There are various different types of representation in the human mind, and time is one kind of representation. Now, when we are going to speak about representations in Kant, this is a general way that he would be speaking about representations in general. Representations may be conscious or unconscious, which I haven't put here. And there are, under these representations in general, particularly there are the representations, the conscious representation is called a perception. Okay. So, in other words, representations or elements in the mind are both conscious or unconscious, and a conscious representation is what he calls a perception. So it is not in the ordinary sense that we speak about perception, that he is speaking here perception. Now, perception can be of two kinds. One is sensation and other is cognition. And what is sensation? Sensation is basically a determination of the subject. That means human mind is determined in a certain fashion, or a human subject, or it is basically a state of the human mind, which is a determination, which is a property of the human mind. So here, when we are going to speak about the sensation, we are not concerned here how sensation is related to the object. On the other hand, when we are going to speak about cognition, cognition too is a representation, or cognition is a perception, which has an object. So a representation that is directed to the object or which has got an object is called a cognition. So it is in that sense that he is speaking about cognition. A representation having an object, a representation which is directed to an object is a cognition. Okay. Now, cognition itself, he is dividing it into two kinds. One is intuition and other is concept. Okay. And what is an intuition? There is a fundamental difference between intuition and concept. And when we speak about intuition, intuition is a representation that is immediately related to the objects. Or we can say an intuition is a representation that is directly related to the object. Concept, on the other hand, is not an immediate representation. Okay, it is related to the object via other representations. That is one way of conceiving concept. Or it is related to the object because of a certain properties which is being shared by other representations. Okay, so the way that we can construe these two things would be something like this. Let us say intuition is always a singular object. So again, if we want to go back to Plato's philosophy, Plato had this notion of universal and particular. Okay, and we know that particular is singular, they exist in space and time, all these various properties that Plato is giving. And when he is going to speak about the universal, he is speaking about universals have number of instances which are particular. Now, this intuition concept distinction is almost analogous. Both concept and intuition exist in the mind, but concepts are general representations of the mind. Under this concept, there can be many representations, including intuitions, and intuitions would be singular representations, whereas concept would be general representations. Now, intuition itself is dividing into two kinds: empirical intuitions and pure intuitions. And empirical intuitions are those intuitions that are derived from our sensory experience, and pure intuitions are those intuitions that lie a priori in the human sensibility or in the human mind. Similarly, concepts also are of two kinds: empirical concepts, which are derived from our experience, and pure concepts, which lie already. So pure concept can be concepts which already lie in the human mind or human understanding, or which are derived from pure intuitions. Okay, and now there are two more representations that he is speaking of. One is notion and other is idea. What is a notion? Notion, here in order to understand what notion is, we need to understand, see, this intuition and concept within the human mind has got two locations. Human mind, we will be coming to that slide soon, has got number of different faculties, and intuitions belong to the faculty of sensibility, whereas concept belong to the faculty of understanding. Two important faculties. There are, of course, other faculties will be coming to them, but the locus of concept is understanding, human understanding, faculty of human understanding, or the power of human understanding, whereas intuition is located in the power of sensibility or the faculty of sensibility. Now, when he is coming to the notion, he's saying notion is pure, and by pure he means which is a priori. And so, if the notion is derived from that which lies in the, or notion is derived from the understanding alone, or a concept that is derived from the understanding alone, is what is called a notion. In other words, so notion is a concept that is derived from a priori concept that is derived from the understanding, then it is called a notion. Idea, on the other hand, again, idea is closely related with the notion. Idea is something composed of different notions. So different notions put together, we have got an idea. An example of idea for him is the idea of God. Here, in order to have this concept of God or the idea of God, we need to take a lot of elements from the faculty of understanding, which are lying already a priori there. That is how we construct this concept, and this is done by the faculty of reason. Now, coming to, so representations can be of two kinds. He says subjective representations and objective representations. Now, sensations are subjective representations. In the sense, it does not have any object. It is related to the way, or it is merely the modifications of the human subject. So that is why it is called a sensations as subjective representation, meaning it does not have an object. It is related only to the subject. Concepts and intuitions, on the other hand, are objective representations, meaning that they are related to objects. So it is in that sense that we are speaking here about objective representations. Now, concept is actually, we will explain here what concept is. Concept is a general cognition whose relation to the object is mediate. And what does it mean to say its relation to the object is mediate? It is related to objects indirectly by means of a property common to several objects. Okay, so there is a property that is common to several objects, and it is because of the possession of those property by the object that a concept is related to that. So it is almost like, speaking about a concept will have a number of objects falling under it. Intuition, on the other hand, is a singular representation which is directly related to the object, and by means of which a thought or a concept is indirectly related to objects. So singular representation, it is a singular representation, and it is immediately related to the object. And through this singular representation, a thought or a concept is related to the objects. So thought and or a concept cannot be directly related to the object. It has to go via the singular representation of intuition. Now let us look at the loci of these representations. And as I have already told you, there are Kant is speaking of the major different faculties of the human mind. In one sense, we can even say Kant was always concerned with the study of the human faculties in one sense or other. So these are the higher cognitive faculties. Understanding is a higher cognitive faculty, then judgment and reason. These are the three higher cognitive faculties. And we can see that under each faculty, under understanding comes sensibility. So it is because of the sensibility that we are able to have the perception of the external physical object. So the understanding, in order to have a perception of the object in the ordinary sense, understanding and sensibility has to work in conjunction with each other. So they have to interact with each other. Now, judgment, the faculty of judgment, and this is concerned primarily with what you call reflective judgment. Kant is speaking about two kinds of judgment. One is called determinate judgment, and other is called reflective judgment. And here, what he speaks, and in a certain, the understanding itself is the faculty of determinate judgment. When we are going to say something is such and such, that is done by the understanding, which is a determinate faculty. Now, judgment, here he is speaking about a reflective judgment, and the function of the reflective judgment is to make judgments of taste. We know that judgments of taste are judgments about beauty, aesthetic experience, etc., etc. And other concern of the reflective judgment is about teleological judgment. Teleological judgments are also made by reflective judgment. Now, in addition, we also have got a faculty of reason, and the faculty of reason and will comes under that faculty of reason. And we know, particularly in moral philosophy, we are speaking about a will that is being determined by, a good will is a will that is being determined by reason alone. So here it is here that practical reason comes into. Will as determined by reason we can call as practical reason, but reason has got a lot of other functions as well. Reason is also working in conjunction with understanding for various kinds of reasoning. So various functions are there for reason, but I have been mentioning only about the practical reason here. Now, concepts belong to higher cognitive faculties of understanding. So concepts, where do they belong? They belong to the higher cognitive faculties of understanding. We are here concerned only with understanding and sensibility. Okay. Now, human intuitions are situated in the sensibility, hence they are known as sensible intuitions. So very often, it is necessary to know that what is the location of these intuitions. As far as we human beings are concerned, we have got only intuitions which are located in the sensibility. That means only through our 5 different senses, they are external senses, and also the internal sense, that we can acquire intuitions. Okay, these are representations that are in the sensibility. Their locus is sensibility. Concepts, on the other hand, are in the understanding. And since they are located in the sensibility, our representation, that means human intuitions, are called sensible intuitions. Now, this term, not this term sensible intuition, this has to be contrasted with intellectual intuitions. Intellectual, suppose there is an understanding that can directly cognize objects without any mediation. Such an understanding will have intellectual intuitions. And Kant says, we human beings do not have intellectual intuitions, and only an original being can have intellectual intuitions. Concepts are classified further into empirical concepts and pure concepts depending upon their source or origin. And we know that pure concepts are those given a priori. So they are already there a priori in the human mind or human understanding, more specifically in the human understanding, and are derived a priori or are derived from a priori intuition. So pure concepts has got two sources. Either they are already there in the understanding, okay, or they are derived from a priori intuitions. Okay, and what is a priori intuition? Of course, we know that Kant has got only two a priori intuitions. One is space and other is time. Now, what are empirical concepts? Empirical concepts are those concepts obtained from empirical intuitions or sensory experience. So that is a source of empirical concepts. Now, intuitions are also classified into a priori and a posteriori. And here again, the foundation for this division is the source of their origin. So how they originate, depending upon how they originate in the sensibility. Now, empirical intuitions are sensible intuitions which relate to objects by means of sensation. So this is one important. Sensible intuitions involve sensation in order to relate to the objects. And how these sensible intuitions arise in the human mind? They arise in the human mind because the objects affect the sensibility. So that is how empirical intuitions, empirical sensible intuitions arise in the human mind because the object affect the human sensibility. On the other hand, when we are looking at a priori intuitions, what are these a priori intuitions? A priori intuitions are merely forms of sensible intuitions. So the way these sensible intuitions arise in the mind, that is what the way, that is what a priori intuitions are. Now, why they are called a priori? They are called a priori because they are not derived from experience. So none of the a priori intuitions are derived from experience, but they lie in the mind prior to the experience. Okay, and they lie in the mind as part of the subjective constitution of the mind. So they are part and parcel of the human mind. That is a priori intuition. More specifically, they are part and parcel of human sensibility. And they are there as a condition for the possibility of experience. Unless these forms of experience, unless these a priori intuitions are there, it is not possible for us human beings to have any experience whatsoever. Now, there is also another classification of intuition, and it is, I think, good to keep that in mind. That is why I have included this slide. On the basis of the way they are presented in the mind, how intuitions are presented to the mind, intuitions are classified into inner intuitions and outer intuitions. And what are outer intuitions? Outer intuitions are those representations by means of which objects are presented as outside or distinct from us. So if you see a physical object, let us say my phone is in front of me, I see it as outside me. Okay, or I see it as away from me. I see it as distinct from me. And what is made possible? This is made possible by the outer intuition. And we know that outer intuition is space for Kant. That is a form in which external objects are presented to us. Now, the inner intuition present their objects are internal to us. So, various mental states that we are having, how do we cognize them? It is through inner intuitions. So I am having a pain or anxiety, feeling of frustrations. These are various internal states of the human subject or human mind or human soul. And these are being cognized through internal intuitions. Oh, sorry, inner intuitions. Okay. And these objects we know are internal to us. And we know the form. The form of inner intuition is time. So inner and outer intuitions are supplied by inner sense and outer sense respectively. And what is an outer sense? Outer sense is that sense by means of which we represent objects to ourselves as in space. On the other hand, by inner sense, Kant means that through which mind intuits itself or its inner state. So, how do we intuit ourselves? It is through with the help of the inner states, inner sense. So now the question is, out of these various kinds of representations that we have been speaking here, what is time? Under what category can we put, under what category does time belong? Okay. So we have already seen that time for Kant is ideal. So it is one of the constituent elements or representations of the mind. But which representation of the mind or which kind of representation of the mind does time belong to? Now, what are the elements of the mind that we have uncovered so far? One is empirical. So we have seen there are empirical concepts. There are pure or a priori concepts, then empirical intuitions and pure intuitions. And we know that other concepts which we have seen like notions and intuitions can be reduced basically to pure concepts, or they are based upon pure concepts. So in addition, there are also other elements such as sensations, notions, and ideas. Okay, so to which type of representation does time belong to? And Kant answers this question in his metaphysical exposition of the concept of time. So therefore, we are moving on to metaphysical exposition of the concept of time. So now, in order to understand what is metaphysical exposition, first we should know what Kant means by an exposition. Okay. So exposition for Kant is a clear and distinct representation which belongs to a concept or what concept signifies. So in an exposition, what happens? We are giving a clear and distinct representation of something which belongs to a concept. So what is this exposition? Here we remember that we have spoken here about a concept and intuition, and he is speaking here about, he is going to speak about the metaphysical exposition of the concept of time. Remember that it is not, or not that, it is not a metaphysical exposition of the intuition of time. So we have, if there is an intuition, then certainly we have a concept that is derived from that. And now here we want to give an exposition of the concept. And here, when we are going to give an exposition, we have to point out to a representation of that which belongs to the concept. Or in other words, a concept signifies certain things. Concept has got a certain content, and we have to illustrate what it signifies. Or in other words, in the contemporary terminology, if you are going to use, a concept refers to certain things and what it refers to. Showing of that is what Kant means by an exposition. Now, if that is an exposition, then what is a metaphysical exposition? So a metaphysical exposition which implies that which exhibit the concept is given a priori. So normally, let us say an exposition is there. Suppose we have got a certain concept, let's say concept of, I have got a concept of mango, and what the representation that exhibits that shows or demonstrate this concept would be the presentation of a mango. Okay, so I can say this exhibits or this signifies a mango. Now here, of course, the mango that is mango is presented to me a posteriori. Okay, it is through the experience that I come across the mango. So the exposition, that which exposes the representation that exposes the concept is not given a priori, but a posteriori. Now in the metaphysical exposition, what happens? Metaphysical exposition is that exposition which exhibit that the concept is given a priori. That means a concept is there, and its exposition, the representation which expresses, or which is an a representation which is an instance of this concept, is also given a priori. So such an exposition is called a metaphysical exposition. That means the concept which a concept needs to be given an exposition, and that which exposes the concept is given a priori, then that exposition will be called a metaphysical exposition. Now let us move on to the metaphysical exposition of time. So we have understood what is meant by exposition. We also have understood what is meant by metaphysical exposition, and now we are moving on to metaphysical exposition of the concept of time. Now it investigates the concept of time. So what we are going to say, we are going to study the concept of time, analyze the concept of time systematically, and then to show the representation which exhibit the time is given a priori. So the representation which exhibit the time, maybe it is quite possible that it could have been given a posteriori, but in the metaphysical exposition of the concept of time, we show that the concept of time, the representation which exhibits the concept of time is a priori. Now this is what the metaphysical exposition is going to do. Now what this metaphysical exposition is, it is basically a set of 5 different arguments. All of them taken together established that the concept of time, we have got a concept of time, and concept of time signifies an a priori intuition. That is why it is metaphysical exposition, because we have got the concept of time, and what exhibits this or what exposes this concept of time is an a priori intuition. In other words, what it tells is that concept of time signifies a priori intuition, or concept of time refers to an a priori intuition. Or put it in other words, time is nothing but an a priori intuition. This is what metaphysical exposition wants to show. Metaphysical exposition of the concept of time establishes. Now, I have already said there are 5 arguments, and we are going to look at each of these arguments and goals of each of the arguments. Okay, and each argument has got a definite goal. And what does the first argument show? The first argument shows time is not an a posteriori representation. So we have already seen it is an element within the mind, therefore it is a representation. And some of these representations are a priori, some of them are a posteriori. And the first argument shows that what time is not, that is what it shows. It is not an a posteriori representation. Second one proves 2 things. One is time is a necessary as well as an a priori representation. And second, it shows that as a necessary and a priori representation, it is the ground of all intuitions, both inner and outer. So in other words, if there has to be whether an inner intuition or outer intuition, it must be grounded in time. These are the 2 things the second argument shows. Now let us look at the third argument. Now, third argument doesn't say anything new. It already reinforces it reinforces the conclusion that time is a necessary and a priori representation. Only thing is that it's a different argument that is being advanced. The goal remains the same. And the fourth and fifth arguments have got the same goal. And says it rejects the possibility, both of them reject the possibility that time is a discursive concept. By discursive concept, what we mean is that time is not a concept that is belonging to the understanding. So those concepts that belong to the understanding, okay, that is what we call a discursive concept here. And instead, so time is not a discursive concept, but what time is, positively these two arguments establish time is an intuition, okay? So, and how it establish, both these arguments establish that time is an intuition by distinguishing between concepts and intuitions on the other. So demarcation between concepts and intuition is something that is very important for the fourth and fifth arguments. Now let us examine each of these arguments one by one. Let us, the first argument is showing that time is not an empirical concept. Okay, so the representation of time is not an empirical concept abstracted from experience. So empirical concepts we know are derived from experience, but representation of time is not an empirical concept derived from experience. Two relations that constitute the concept of time are the relations of simultaneity and succession. So when you look at the concept of time, we cannot conceive time without relations of simultaneity and succession. So things that are happening in time occur either as simultaneous or as succeeding one after the other, or before and after. That is very important for time. Now, if suppose time were an empirical concept, then these relations, that is simultaneity and succession, must be derived from experience. So in other words, we should have had the experience of simultaneity and we should have the experience of succession, and then only we could have derived the concept of time. So in that case, time would have been an empirical concept. But even before the experience of simultaneity and succession, we do perceive things as simultaneous. In other words, we do not perceive simultaneity and succession as such, but we perceive events as occurring as either simultaneous or successive. So whenever we are perceiving events, we perceive them either as occurring simultaneous or as successive. Now, how this is possible? Now, he says for us to perceive events as simultaneous or successive, it is necessary that the representation of time grounds simultaneity and succession prior to the experience of those events. So even before the experience of events are simultaneous and successive, the notion of simultaneity and succession, or the notion of before and after, must already be built into our representation of time. It is in that sense that he says representation of time must ground simultaneity and succession. In other words, it is the nature of time that events through which the events which are perceived with the help of this representation of time must be either simultaneous or succession, and these relations of simultaneity and succession cannot be derived from experience of events. So only under the presupposition of the representation of time can we represent several things as being at one and the same time or different times. So by different times, what he means is events that are occurring one after the other. So if things are occurring one after the other, they are all different times. They are occurring at different times. So either they are occurring simultaneously at one time or at different times. And this we are able to represent only because we have got the representation of time or the intuition of time. It is necessary to presuppose time for the experience of things as simultaneous and successive, then the representation cannot be an empirical concept. So already we need time in order to represent simultaneity and succession of events. In that case, time cannot be derived from experience. So it cannot be an empirical concept. And then, so what we have seen is that time is not an empirical concept. Now he is trying to say, the next argument is trying to say time is a necessary representation. Okay. Now the argument is based on the way time and appearances stand in relation of dependence. So what is the relationship between time and things that are appearing in time? So anything that appears in time, we know that entire physical world and our mental world appears in time. So what is the relationship between time on the one hand, appearances on the other? Now, three possible positions about the relation between time and appearance we can conceive. First is to say there is absolutely no relation of dependence between time and appearance. Both time and appearances are mutually independent. This is one position. And second position that we can take is that time is dependent on the appearances. Okay, that means appearance, without appearances, we cannot have time. And third position is that appearances are dependent upon time. That means we cannot have appearances without time. Among these three positions, Kant is taking the third position, that appearances are dependent on time, but time is not dependent on appearance. Now, with the help of this, this relation, he is trying to show that time is a necessary representation. Now, Kant rules out the first and second position with the help of the following argument. It is not possible to remove time from appearances. That means we cannot remove time from appearances. We cannot take away time from appearances, but we can take appearances away from time. So in other words, from the time we can remove appearances, but from appearances we cannot remove time. Okay, in other words, appearances do not have a being of its own if time is removed. If we remove time from appearances, then along with the removal of time, appearances ceases to be. So all actuality of appearance is possible only in time. So appearances are dependent upon time. But on the other hand, we can take away appearances from time. And if you are taking away appearances from time, what remains is empty time. In other words, we can think of or we can conceive of empty time, but we cannot conceive of appearances devoid of time. Thus, we can represent empty time, but we cannot represent appearances without time. Appearances would go away, but time as the general condition for the possibility of appearances cannot be removed. So time is, this is the crux of the point. Time is a general condition, a condition for the possibility of appearances. Okay, and therefore time cannot be removed. If time cannot be removed, then time is a necessary representation, and if it is a necessary representation, it must be given a priori. Okay, and as a necessary representation, it grounds all intuition. So far what he has said is, first he has shown that time is not an empirical concept. Then he says time is a necessary representation as the ground of all intuitions. Now we are moving into the third argument. Third argument is speaking about again about necessity and a priority of time. So earlier we have seen the time is a necessary representation. Same thing he is repeating here, but a different argument is already advanced here. So what is the argument? So this argument is based on the possibility of propositions of principles pertaining to time as necessary and a priori. That means there are certain principles that are about time And these principles or these propositions are both necessary propositions and they are also a priori propositions. And what are these principles? He calls them. These principles are known as relations of time or axioms of time. These are the names of these principles. Now he is mentioning two such axioms of time. Time has got only one dimension. This we have encountered it earlier. This is one axiom. And other is different times are not simultaneous but successive. So this is the second axiom. Now both these axioms have two features as propositions. They both of them are necessary propositions, not contingent. That means time has got only one dimension. If it is true, it is necessarily true. And then it is not something that we come to know through experience. Therefore, it must be a priori. Now, the question that he is asking, how these are possible as a priori and necessary. How these propositions would become possible a priori and necessary. So, first he is trying to say why axioms of time are not empirical. So it is quite possible that they are empirical. So Kant wants to rule out that possibility. Axioms of time are strictly universal and apodeictically necessary and certain. So these are the properties of these three properties of these propositions. They are universals, okay, and they are apodeictically certain. That is, apodeictically certain means necessarily certain, necessary. So there's an element of necessity associated with it. Okay. And experience would not yield strict universality or apodeictic certainty. So anything that is derived from the experience cannot be, strictly speaking, a universal proposition. So any proposition or a statement that is derived from experience cannot be a strictly universal proposition, because what we have experienced is for a duration of time, and it can only speak about that it holds for such and such a duration of time, and it cannot say anything more than that. It cannot say it is necessarily going to happen in this fashion all times and everywhere. We cannot speak of that with regard to the experience. So with the help of experience, we can only say this is what common perception teaches us. So in other words, this is how things are. That's all we can say. This is how matters stand, but it cannot say this is how matters must stand. This is how things should be. It cannot say. This is how things are. That is all what experience can tell us. Therefore, these principles cannot be drawn or obtained from experience. Because these principles has got a necessity and universality built into them, this necessity and universality cannot be drawn from experience, because experience can never give us those features. Now, so the axioms, so we have seen why they are not empirical. These axioms are not empirical. And now he is trying to say why these axioms are necessary and a priori. Now, these axioms, here we are not speaking about a representation of time, but here we are speaking about the axioms of time. Okay. These axioms of time are necessary and a priori because they are valid rules under which alone experience is possible. Now, they are necessary. Why they are necessary? Because they are valid rules. And without these rules, experience cannot occur. Experience is not possible without these kinds of rules. In other words, when we are looking at anything that is presented in time would be one-dimensional, okay, is successive, not either successive or it would be simultaneous. Now, these are a priori. Why they are being called a priori? Because they instruct us, these rules instruct us prior to the experience. Even before we are going to have the experience, they tell us how experience would be like. Our experiences can be only one after the other or simultaneous, not in any other way. So these things are not learned through perception or experience. Now, we know that the strict universality, and this is two marks of a priority according to Kant, are universality and necessity. If a proposition is universal, or if a concept is universal and necessary, that would be a priori. Similarly, a proposition is universal and necessary, that too would be a priori. Hence, axioms of time, both the axioms of time, that time is one-dimensional and different times are successive, not simultaneous. These are, these axioms are a priori. Now, how does we, from this, he is drawing an argument that, he is trying to say, how are axioms of time possible and necessary a priori? So we have seen why we call them a priori and necessary, and how at all these axioms of time are possible. This is the next question that he is asking. That is the crux of the argument. Okay, how these two axioms of time or different axioms of time are possible, necessary, and a priori, and how they become necessary and how they become a priori. And we have already seen axioms of time possesses the features of universality, necessity, and a priority. And how they are derived? They are derived from the representation of time. Okay. Now, if there has to be an axiom of time, that axiom of time must be derived from the representation of time. That is very clear. We don't have anything else to look upon to arrive at the axioms of time. They must be derived from the representation of time. Now, look at the axioms. Axiom have universality, necessity, and a priority. And if these axioms, which have got the features of universality and necessity and a priority, are derived from the representation of time, then the representation of time from which this principle must be derived must be a priori necessary representation. So both the features of necessity and a priority must be there in the case of the representation of time. So the representation from which these axioms are derived themselves must have got the property of a priority and necessity. So thus Kant's answer is that axioms of time are possible, a priori, and necessary because they are based on time, and time itself is an a priori and necessary representation. That is what he wanted to show. Time is basically an a priori representation as well as a necessary representation. Now, so let us say we have already seen three arguments, and what they have done so far. Let us just make an assessment. The above arguments show that time is not an empirical concept, but an a priori and necessary representation. That is what we have seen so far. This necessary representation, now the question is, this necessary representation could either be an a priori concept or an a priori intuition. So we have ruled out that is a possibility of a priori concept, empirical concept that we have ruled out. And then we said it is basically a necessary representation and a priori representation. But representation is a very general term. A representation can be a concept or an intuition. So therefore here it would be an a priori concept or an a priori intuition. So in the fourth argument, Kant wants to prove time is not a discursive or a general concept. So he wants to rule out it is an a priori concept, but a fewer form of sensible intuition. It is a priori intuition. That is what he wants to show. So the arguments consist of the arguments, that means the fourth argument. Sorry, I'm speaking here about the fourth argument. Fourth argument consists of two smaller arguments, and each of these smaller parts, each of these sub-arguments concludes that time is an intuition. Now let us look at the fourth argument. So we are going to look at the first part of the fourth argument, and all of them, this part is trying to say time is not a concept but a pure intuition. Now let us see what are the premises of the argument. I have put it in the inverted comma, the premises of the argument as it figures in the Critique of Pure Reason. Different times are only parts of one and the same time. That representation, however, which can only be given through a single object, is an intuition. So these are the premises from which he is going to conclude that time is a pure intuition and not a concept. Now, when you look at this, when you have read this, it is not clear how the conclusion that time is not an intuition and not a concept is drawn from the premises. Okay, but the conclusion follows if an additional assumption that is already tacit here is made explicit. So let's try to make explicit. These propositions themselves are not, these premises themselves are not enough to clearly arrive at the conclusion that time is an intuition. So let us look at what are they. There must be a tacit assumption here. And what is that assumption? Let us try to see. Now, before going to the tacit assumption, let us try to look at let us separate each of these premises. The first premise, different times are only parts of one and the same time. So here, Kant is clearly stating there is only one time. And when we talk about different times, we mean different parts of the same time. In other words, there is only one time. And whenever we are talking about different times, we are speaking about different parts of the same time. Now, that is the first premise. The second premise says that representation which can be given which can only be given through a single object is an intuition. So here he is going to give a definition of an intuition. Another definition may be an intuition is a representation which can be given through a single object. That is an intuition. So that means intuition is a singular representation. An intuition is a representation which is given through a single object. Now, if you look at these two things, the conclusion that time is an intuition does not follow from these two premises. So therefore, the need, if we want to draw the conclusion, then there is a need for additional premise. So to draw the conclusion from the premises, we need to add another premise regarding what concept is and how it is different from intuition. So in other words, we need to have a clear statement as to what concept is and how concept and intuitions are different. If that is added, then of course we can draw the conclusion that time, it is possible for us to draw the conclusion that time is an intuition. At least even if we are not saying what concept is and how it is different from intuition, minimum that we need to state is that concept is not a representation that can be given through a single object. Okay, so let us see how. So we are going to clarify what concept and intuition is here. But within the argument, if you're looking at the fourth argument, there you will not find this. But we have, it is given elsewhere in the critique. So we are going to draw from that distinction he makes elsewhere. Now, Kant defines, how does Kant define a concept? Kant defines a concept as a representation that refers to the object indirectly through a property common to several objects. Okay, so in other words, this is the way a universal is related to the object. How a universal is related to the object? The universal is related to the object, I'm using Platonic language, through a number of instantiations. Okay, so a concept as a representation refers to an object indirectly through a property common to several objects. So a property that is being instantiated by a number of objects, it is true that a concept is related to objects. Okay, so there is a medium, a common property, a property that is common to several objects. It is with the help of that property that a concept is related to objects. A concept is a representation which, in contrast to an intuition, is given through several infinitely many objects. In other words, a concept can have infinitely many representations. Now, now let us see how he is coming to this conclusion. The two given premises, along with the tacit premise which we have stated right now, entail that time is an intuition. So if both these things have been, if all these three premises are there, we can see how time turns out to be an intuition. From the distinction between concept and intuition, we have already seen the distinction between concept and intuition. It follows time is not a concept but an intuition. And why do we say time is a concept, not a concept but an intuition? Because time, the representation of time, possesses the properties of intuitions, and it does not possess the properties of a concept. And what is the property of an intuition that time possesses? Unlike concept, time is given through a single representation. And why we know that there is only one time, so it is given through a single representation. There is only one representation of time. Whereas if you are going to speak about a concept, it will have number of instances. So time does not have different instances. We have got only one time. We can only divide that time into different segments. Okay. So therefore, since there is only one time, there cannot be a concept. The original representation of time cannot be a concept but an intuition. If time were a concept, then the representation of time could be given to several objects. In other words, it would have had number of instances that we cannot speak about time. Time does not have a number of instances. Okay, so therefore, time is not a concept, since there is only one intuition. There is only one time. It can be given only through an intuition, not through concepts. So he is trying to show that time is basically an intuition. So there is only one time. So I'm going to just rehearse the argument here in a slightly different way, so that we get to know what the crux of the argument is. There is only one time, and different times are merely parts of the same time. Okay. The representation of time can be given through a single object or single representation. Here, object and representation is used more or less in a synonymous way. A representation that can be given through a single object is an intuition. Okay, and therefore time is an intuition because representation of time is given through a single representation. Now let us look at the second part of the argument, fourth argument. It says time is not a concept but a pure sensible intuition. Okay, by the way, I have taken about more than 1 hour. Is it okay to continue, or should I conclude?
Oh, yes, sir. I think it's okay if we continue. Yeah.
Yeah, it will be. I think shortly it will be over. Okay. So the argument, the fourth part of the argument, time is not a concept but a pure sensible intuition. So that is what the second part also he wants to establish the same thing. The second part of the argument too is meant to show that time is a pure sensible intuition. The argument consists in showing that axioms of time cannot be derived from the general concept of time. So here, in the second part, what he is trying to rely upon is axioms of time. Okay, how we can have axioms of time possible? How are axioms of time possible? Now consider this axiom of time. Different times cannot be simultaneous. The principle is not, or this proposition is not derivable from the general concept of time. And there is a reason why he is telling that it cannot be derived from the general concept of time. If you have got a concept, Anything that is derived from a concept, a proposition that is derived from a concept would be an analytic proposition. Whereas in the synthetic proposition is not something derived from the concept alone. We need to have intuition in addition to concept. Okay, so if the principle, these different times where cannot be simultaneous, where derived from the concept of time, this proposition would have been an analytic proposition, but we know that it is not an analytic proposition, but it is a synthetic proposition, because the concept of different time does not imply the notion that it is not simultaneous. So it is not contained in that. So being synthetic, it cannot arise from the general concept of time alone. Okay. So for its derivation, we require the assistance of intuition. So in addition to the concept of concept, we also require an intuition. Therefore, it is a synthetic proposition, not an analytic proposition. So the proposition is contained in the intuition and the general concept. So both the concept of time as well as intuition is required in order to derive this proposition. Therefore, the original representation of time, okay, is an intuition. Original representation of time means that representation from which the concept of time is derived. Okay, that representation is an intuition and not a concept. Now coming to the final argument, that is, again, it shows that time is an intuition and not a concept. This argument again is based on the distinction between concept and intuition. And here what he is trying to show is that time is an infinite magnitude. And we know that if something is an infinite, we cannot determine it. We cannot say how much it is. Okay? So that is why an infinite magnitude cannot be determined. But we know that he says time is infinite magnitude, but we do have determinate magnitudes of time. That means we can specify the duration of time. We can say this time is 1 hour, or it is half an hour, it is 10 minutes. Different determination of the magnitude of time is possible for us. Now, so what he says, every determinate magnitude of time is possible only through the limitation of a single time that grounds it. So if that is the case, if we are able to, if it is possible for us to divide time or determine the time or measure the time, then it must be through a limitation that grounds the time. Limitation through limiting the time. So that means time as such is given, we are limiting it in a certain way, and as a result of which we have got determination of time. If every determinate magnitude of time is possible only through limitation of a single time, then the original representation of time must be unlimited. So the original representation, he says, is unlimited, and the other when we are going to determine time for our practical purposes, we are limiting it in various ways. Now, now here again he is speaking something about the distinction between concept and intuition. Now, there is a difference in the way concepts represent things and intuitions represent the things. Concepts cannot represent the whole of a thing. Okay? Because concepts are partial representations. Whenever we have got a concept, that concept is only speaking about a part of the object or one aspect of the object. The parts of the whole and any magnitude of objects in the whole can be determinately represented only through the limitation of a concept. Only when concept comes, okay, so that means different parts of a whole can be specifically spoken or determinately spoken with the help of a concept. Now, but suppose we want to represent something as such, something as a whole, and that representation must be an intuition and not a concept. So that is how he distinguishes between another distinction between intuition and concept. Now, concepts are partial representations of an object, whereas intuitions of an object represent it as a whole. Since time is an infinite magnitude, it cannot be represented as such. That means it cannot be represented as an infinite something by concepts, but only by intuition. The concept can represent time only determinately by imposing the limitation on the original representation of time, which is an intuition. So, original intuition of time, which is infinite, which is of infinite magnitude, is given to us, and we divide and determine the specific time that we require, or specific division of time, specific measure of time that we require, depending upon our purpose. Moreover, concepts are employed for representing things whose parts are conceived as preceding the whole. So this is another thing concepts are employed for representing things whose parts are conceived preceding the whole. So in other words, when we are going to speak about the representation of concepts, where are they applied? They are applied when we are speaking about things which can be divided into parts and whole. So parts are given, we are already given parts, and how the whole is combined out of parts. Only in such cases concepts are used. In the case of intuition, whole is considered primary, and it doesn't have any determinate parts. So in other words, in the case of intuition, the whole itself is given, but concepts are partial representations. By putting different concepts, only we will have the whole, the representation of the whole. So that is the difference between. So in other words, here what we find is that representation of time has the characteristics of an intuition, and it doesn't have the characteristics of a concept. Therefore, representation of time is an intuition. This is the argument that he is making. Now coming to the conclusion. So all the 5 arguments that we have seen, and now coming to the conclusion, and we just want to show that ontology of time is subjective. So Kant denies all claims of time to absolute reality. We have already seen that time is not something that is absolutely real. He denies time belongs to things as a condition of their existence. Okay, that was the Newtonian view that he rejects because it leads to absurdity. He also denies that time belongs to things as a property determined by objects that subsist by themselves. The Leibnizian view of time, that also he is rejecting because it cannot explain how a priori intuitions, or sorry, synthetic a priori propositions about time is possible. Does it mean time has no reality? Now Kant says, yes, in one sense, time is unreal. That means time is unreal from an absolute point of view. Okay, so that is why unreality of time from an absolute point of view. Now, objects are considered in themselves when we regard them through reason alone. So we can consider objects in 2 different ways. We can think about them. We can reason about them without the aid of any experience, without the aid of any sensibility. That is one point of view that we can approach things. So considered in that way, temporal properties or relations do not belong to objects. So from the point of view of reason, if you are looking at the objects, or if you are considering objects, we do not find any temporal properties in the objects. So time is nothing in itself. If you are going to look at the objects in themselves and see if there is time, there is no time over there, either as the condition of the objects or as a property of the objects. It is neither a determination of things in themselves. Okay, so it is not a property of the things, nor a condition for the possibility of things in themselves. Now, so viewed from the reason, time is merely. So what is it? So we are going to take a transcendental or an absolute point of view. From an absolute point of view, when we look at the things, among the things, we don't find time. And where do we find time? Time is merely an inner intuition. that inhibit the human sensibility. So time as a form of intuition, form of inner intuition, is there in the human sensibility prior to any experience as a condition for experience. It is not condition for the objects in the absolute sense, but as a condition for the appearances or condition for experiences. So therefore, time is ideal. That is why Kant says time is transcendently ideal. That means from an absolute point of view, time has no being in the objects in themselves, but it has got a being only in the human sensibility. Okay, therefore, time is ideal, and his own words is his own expression is that time is transcendently ideal. Now, time has a subjective reality. So here it is very clear. Time has got a reality. Is time real? In another way, we can say time has got a subjective reality because time has its being in the human mind as an a priori form of human sensible intuition. So as the a priori form of inner intuition, time is the subjective condition under which alone all our intuitions, both inner and outer, can take place. So a time is the subjective condition. Only because of the availability of this subjective condition, our intuitions are possible. Whether we are going to speak about outer intuition or inner intuition, this is possible only because the intuition of time or the form of the time, form of the intuition of time is already there. Now, in addition, so far we have been speaking from the point of view of reason, and we can also look at objects from the point of view of the senses. That means how we experience them. That is the point of view of the senses. So that means here when we are going to consider the object, we also take into account the nature and constitution of human sensibility. So when we treat objects as objects of senses, then time is intuited in a certain determinate relations and are called appearances. So what are these objects? The objects as they affect us, as they are accessed through the sensibility, they are called appearances. So there are determinate relations between these appearances. And when you look at the appearances, so objects, when we are considering them as appearances, then what happens? These determinate relations are relations of succession, simultaneity, and persistence. So these three relations of succession, relations of simultaneity, relations of persistence, all of them are applicable to what? Applicable to objects as they are presented to our sensibility. So in a certain sense, time belongs to objects, or we can attribute the temporal properties to what? To the objects of experience or to appearances. These temporal relations hold among objects encountered in experience. Therefore, time is objectively valid or empirically real. So the reality, the final slide, we are coming to the conclusion. So we can say that when we are going to speak about the reality of time, we can only say that time is relative. We can speak about the reality of time relative to the point of view. Look at earlier thinkers like Parmenides, Zeno of Elea, or Bradley. They believed that time has no reality whatsoever. They totally rejected the time. Okay, so for them, time is unreal. But he disagrees with time is unreal. He disagrees with other realists with regard to the ontological status of. These are the people who have rejected the time. There are also people who accepted the ontological status of time. And they maintain that either the time subsists on its own, or that it is determined by things that subsist by themselves. So he disagrees with the realists who grant that time, or absolutists who grant that there is time, okay, either as a condition for the existence of things or as something that is emerging, or as a property of things that exist. So he is not agreeing either to the Parmenidean Bradleyan position on time, nor does he agree with the Leibnizian kind of a view where time is a property, or the Newtonian view that time is basically the condition for the existence of things. So instead, he believes that time is real, but how it is real? It is subjectively real. Subjectively real means it is real and exists in the human mind. If we can use the term exist at all, exists in the human mind. More specifically, it exists in that part of the human mind called human sensibility as a form of inner intuition. In other words, time has a subjective ontology. So that is all what I want to say. I have taken a little more time than I expected. I am sorry about it.
No, sir, absolutely. It was a lovely presentation, sir. Very rigorous and thorough. Thank you so much. I think we can now leave the floor open to questions.
Yes.
There are
I
some
don't know whether
questions.
there have been any questions that have been already raised.
So there are a few questions in the chat. I can read them out, sir.
Oh, all right. Yeah.
Okay. So the first one is, how are intellectual intuitions different from a priori intuitions?
Right. Okay, let us see. The intellectual intuition, in a certain sense, we can speak of them as a priori intuitions. Okay. So if you all intellectual intuitions, if at all there are intellectual intuitions, they must be a priori. But remember that Kant says that there are no intellectual intuition for human beings, but only for an original being there would be intellectual intuitions. So who is an original being? An original being which will intuit certain things, and immediately the thing that has to be the being intuits would be there. That would be the nature of an original being. So roughly we can say, because Kant does not use this term, but we can say God is an original being, because whatever he intuits is there. He doesn't require any kind of intellect in order to intuit things. Any kind of sensibility in order to intuit things. So clearly, if at all there is an intellectual intuition, that has to be an a priori intuition. But here, Kant, when he is going to speak about a priori intuition, he is not speaking about an intuition of the intellect, okay, either of human or of divine. Rather, he is speaking about an intuition that we human beings have. That is an a priori intuition that belong to the human sensibility. So in other words, that is why it is called a priori intuition, but it is sensible. Sensible here means belonging to the faculty of sensibility. Such intuitions are a priori intuitions. Certainly, as you are pointing out, if there is an intellectual intuition, that also must be a priori intuition. But here he is speaking about not about a priori intuitions that belong to the intellect, but a priori intuitions that belong to the sensibility. And space and time are the two such intuitions, a priori intuitions.
Okay, sir, that makes it clear. The next question is, can you please give examples for the major faculties of the human mind? Understanding, judgment, and reason.
These are the major faculties of the human mind. Yes. These are the examples of the faculties of the human mind, isn't it? So how do we understand the faculties? Faculties we understand as the different modules of the human mind. That means mind itself is divided into different. It is not a one single indivisible kind of a thing. It has got different components or different abilities, different potentialities. And what are these potentialities? So he is speaking. I have already given in the slide 6 different faculties. These are the major faculties. One is the faculty of sensibility, and other is the faculty of understanding. So the faculty of understanding and faculty of sensibility interact among themselves for us to have perceptions. Okay, any kind of cognition of the physical object is possible only because any intuition that we have must be interpreted by the understanding using its concepts or using its categories. So another faculty is the faculty of reflective judgment. And as I told you, the function of the reflective judgment is to make judgments, reflective judgments. And the reflective judgment, as I mentioned already, they are of two kinds. Judgments about taste. So we see, let us say, a painting and say, appreciate its beauty and judge that it is beautiful. It is a judgment of taste. And whenever we are going to speak about certain, the purposiveness of nature, let us say we have got an organism in the nature, let us say a plant or any other living organism, and we say why it is there. What is the goal of this in the overall organization of the world? Okay, when we make such a kind of a statement, we are making a teleological judgment, a judgment of purpose. Okay, so this is the function. Making such a judgment is the function of the faculty of judgment, and faculty of judgment, it has got a corresponding lower faculty, and its corresponding lower faculty is the faculty of feeling and feeling of pain and pleasure. Okay, so it is because of the feeling of pain and pleasure, maybe particularly if you are going to speak about something is beautiful, we say that it gives us pleasure, so the object that gives us pleasure is being considered as beautiful. Now, the reason is also a higher faculty, and it works in conjunction with all other faculties, certainly. Faculty of understanding, the faculty of judgment, and also the lower faculty that comes under the faculty of, directly comes under the faculty of judgment, is the faculty of will. We are able to decide and act. Okay, will is that will help us to act certain things. Okay, such or come to a decision. So that is being determined when, if, of course, it can be determined by our desires. Will can be determined by our desires. Kant would say such a will that is being determined by a desire is not a good will. But a good will is that will which is determined by reason. Reason will tell will what is to be done. And if it is doing in accordance with the dictate of the reason, then it would be a good will. So these are the major faculties of the human mind according to Kant. In addition to, there are also certain kind of a linked faculty like imagination. These are also, imagination is also a faculty, sub-faculty. Is this clear? Do we need further examples for this? Because this is the examples of faculties, right?
No, sir, I think that's clear. Clear. Thank you. The third question is, what is the nature of the past and future for Kant? Does he share with Augustine in arguing for a presentism? That is the view that only the present exists.
See, when we are looking at time, it doesn't seem that Kant is speaking about presentism. Okay, because look at the way that we have analyzed the time. Three relations that he is giving. Three relations that he is giving is the relation of simultaneity, okay, and before and after. Let us say relations of before and after, and relations of simultaneity. Let us consider these two relations. Now, he is, see, we have a scene. There is in Magtagat, there is a distinction between, he makes a distinction between A time and B time. Okay. So what is the A time? A time is the division of time into past, present, and future. That is A time. On the other hand, if you are going to conceive time as an event has occurred, and before that another event occurred, if it is ordered in that, in accordance with the relations of before and after, then that would be called B time. It seems, so now there is a lot of debate in history of philosophy whether which of these theories of time has to be accepted. And Maktagard, for example, is one person who argued that time is not real because he thought that the essence of time lies in A time, not B time, but it leads because the notion of present is there, and the notion of present leads to various kinds of contradictions. So A time cannot be there, and if A time is not there, then of course B time also does not make much sense. So that is a kind of a position that Maktagard held. And now Kant is not holding on to such kind of a position, but it is very clear that he is holding on to some sort of a B theory of time. Okay, so he would not at any point of time grant that present is the only time that there is. Present is the only reality that there is. He would also grant past, present, and future. And if present is being specified, that time that comes before the present would be past, and that is going to come after that would be future. So he is not a presentist in any case.
Okay, sir.
Yeah.
And the last question for the day, I think, is the feeling of the passage of time a qualia?
Pardon?
Is the feeling of the passage of time a qualia?
That of course is not something that this is. See, for example, what are qualia? This is another thing which we would be interested in finding out. Roughly speaking, in a very, very mundane terms, if you want to speak about qualia are basically, in a certain sense, a version of the sensation. Sensations themselves are qualia. So the question, therefore, is that whether when there is a passage of time, can we have a feeling of that passage? Yes, we do have got a feeling of feeling, but can time be reduced to some kind of a qualia? When a passage of time occurs, we are maybe aware of it. There may be a certain kind of a sensation associated with that is fine. But passage of time itself cannot be reduced to a qualia. Okay, and similarly, time also cannot be reduced to a qualia. Of course, it is true that there can be a certain kind of a qualia associated with it, in the sense there is something it is like to have that passage of time. In that sense, there is qualia of time. But more than that, whether time can be reduced to qualia or passage of time can be reduced to qualia, I don't think that would be a feasible kind of a position.
I think we can end here for today then. On behalf of the Philosophical Society and all the audience members, I'd like to thank you for taking out the time to deliver this lecture, sir. It was Kant is a notoriously difficult philosopher to understand, but at the same time, he's a very revolutionary and important one too. So I think the presentation was really amazing. The entire order of concepts that you presented was very thorough, rigorous, and clear. So thank you so much, sir. We hope to host you in the future too soon. And
okay, thank you, Akamjin. It was nice to talk to all of you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much.
thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.